I'd just like to thank you all for coming, and I'd like you all to thank James and Adrian for coming all the way down. I'd like to begin this session with saying that it's a safe space, obviously, which means you can't discriminate against anyone in terms of sexuality or identity, or go out of your way to hurt anyone's feelings, obviously. And I think Adrian and James are probably going to start off with a short speech about what they stand for, what their parties stand for. Is that from you two?
Yes, we have to. Who's going first? Would you like to? Go after you.
Okay.
See, I'll start by being nice, then I don't have to be late.
I'm quite happy to sit here if that's all right, if everyone can hear me. My name is Adrian Trett. I'm chair of LGBT plus Liberal Democrats. We are the Liberal Democrat organisation within the Liberal Democrats which campaign on LGBT issues. Our organisation used to be called DELGA, as some of you may have heard previously, and we have been around since the joining of the SDP and the Liberals in about 1987. So we've been around a long time and campaigning for a long time on all the issues regarding LGBT equality. As for me, I'm actually chair for the second year, next year coming, and I'm also a former student of University of Canterbury. University of Kent at Canterbury, so I'm very pleased to come back here and to see the university and to see the group that when I was here didn't exist. So I'm really pleased to see that there is a campaigning group on LGBT equality, and that's great to see. As for sort of our main issues and campaigning threads, obviously I won't give everything away when we just give you some questions and answers later on policies and details and what your ideas are. But obviously the big issues at the moment are equal marriage. We are the first party in the UK to actually officially have this as party policy, or one of the main parties. I will say the Greens do have it, but so they're actually out of the three of us main parties, we are the first party to have that as our main party policy, which went through in conference in 2010, and that's why we are continuing to work on those issues at the moment. There are other issues like the blood ban, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and the Transgender Action Plan, which is the first ever Transgender Action Plan, which is being worked out by government at the moment. Other key areas are particularly international LGBT issues. I don't know if some of you read Pink News a lot, or the LGBT asylum news, which describes what goes on in countries around the world, which currently about 80 or so countries still have severe discrimination, up to, unfortunately, death in some circumstances in some countries. There's about 80 countries around the world. So we are campaigning on helping in those countries and trying to make their lives better where we can. And that all relates to funding as well, which is something that the government's mentioned in the last couple of months about the aid budget and how much we decide to give to countries where we feel the human rights possibly aren't being treated and looked after at the level that we would hope that they would be. Which doesn't mean that funding is going to be cut, but it might be sort of distributed in a different way, away from governments, but possibly to NGOs and other bodies who are actually doing good work from an educational or famine or those sort of issues. So that's another key strand. But as a campaigning body, we have a sort of large executive, 12 people on the executive, and this is the first year ever in 2011 that we've actually had a contested election for executive places. So there were 19 people up for election who wanted to stand, and obviously only 9 of them could make the executive group. So that's great to see that there's enthusiasm, people wanting to be part of it and actually wanting to make an effort and put their there's one thing of doing lots of talking and meeting, but there's another thing about putting it into action and actually striving to campaign across the LGBT issues. We also prides, which I'm sure you're all aware of, happen around the country, particularly London Pride, which is where I'm based here in London, so I usually organise that with a few other London Liberal Democrats, but we also attended Manchester Pride, Liverpool Pride, and various other prides around the country. So that's one of our key campaigning times, is when there's a pride on, we always like to come down and be a part of the celebrations and the convivial atmosphere that usually exist at prides around the country. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a pride in Canterbury, which we haven't attended as yet, but I'm sure if there was one, we would be here to be present. So I think that's a general gist, but I'm sure there's lots of questions in there as well. So I won't take up all the policy issues, and I'll leave some for James as well to look after. So thanks very much.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. Unlike him, I can't suck up by pretending to become here. But my share of this is that my partner did manage to study for a term here, so that kind of, I don't know if that helps or hinders actually, because it ran away afterwards. So I'm trying to work out. I know it's not good, is it? So I'm not sure whether that helps or not. I was trying to remember the last time I was here. It's going to make me sound like an old git, but it was 18 years ago, I think. So. People are looking at me now with kind of sadness in their eyes. I think at one point in time, I used to be Vice President of the National Union of Students, so I think I must have been back then. But thank you for inviting me, because I do quite like coming and doing student union-based ones, because it kind of fond memories of doing NUS stuff, so it's quite nice to come back and talk at these things. I'm co-chair of LGBT Labour. We are a Labour campaign for lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans rights. We are affiliated to the Labour Party. We're a slightly different setup to the Lib Dems, who are kind of a part of the Lib Dems, in that we're a kind of separate body that affiliates to the Labour Party. Officially, in Labour Party terms, we count as a socialist society, which is a slightly coverall term that covers a range of different groups that affiliate the Labour Party, from think tanks like the Favourite Society through to housing groups and the Labour Party Black Members Group and that kind of thing. And so that gives us it gives us quite a lot of say within the Labour Party and a link into it to influence them, to lobby them. It also gives us a nice degree of independence, so when we think they're not doing what we want, they should be doing, it gives them a little bit of freedom to set our own policy and batter them over the head if they needed to, which has helped occasionally in the past. As a group, we've been around since we were formed originally in 1975, so we've been around quite some time. Set up in the mid-70s as the Labour Gay Group, and at some point they merged into the Labour Lesbian Gay Group, and then the Labour Campaign for Lesbian Gay Rights, and then the B was added, and then eventually we ended up as LGBT Labour, which kind of helps as a guide to the evolution of gay rights as it kind of encompassed more people and broadened its campaigning technique over the years. We have a number of patrons. We kind of try and work and get links into people who can have some influence on policy. So our patrons are the openly gay and lesbian members of different parliaments. So we've got 7 members of the House of Commons who are our patrons, a couple of members of the House of Lords, and a member of the European Parliament in Michael Cashman. So that gives us some kind of reach, so that we've got people we can go to and kind of speak on our behalf in different bits of Parliament and in Europe as well. And part of our work we do is actually campaigning to try and get more openly LGBT politicians. So we have a councillors network trying to get more out councillors at a local level, which I'm sure the guys from Canterbury Pride will understand is quite important to have kind of voices speaking on your local council for you, but also trying to make sure we get more people into Parliament as well, and particularly into Wales and Scotland, where there's been kind of pretty poor representation compared to what we've achieved for all the parties in the House of Commons. And we set up something a few years ago called Dorothy's List, which was a joke name that stuck, which was basically a fundraising campaign to raise some money to give to out Labour candidates in the general election. We decided to try and raise £2,000, and we ended up raising £13,000, which just kind of showed the kind of goodwill and support there was out there to actually do this, and no one had done it before. So we've kept that going, and we've opened it up to the European Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, and the London Assembly elections, which are coming up next year. We've renamed it to something a bit more serious now, which is the Chris Smith list, after Chris Smith, who was obviously the first member of Parliament ever to be openly gay. We'll give it a more serious title. It was one of those joke names that stuck and caught on, and it worked, but for a longer term we thought we might have to pretend to be a bit more serious than just go Friends of Dorothy all the way through. So a bit like some of the stuff that Adrian's talked to you about, obviously a lot of our campaigning work exists around prides during the summer, and we obviously do all the big ones like Manchester, Liverpool, Brighton, London, but we try and support as many smaller ones as we can too. So we try and get to as many of those. Obviously there are quite a proliferation of them now. I think there are over 30 or more, so that makes it quite difficult. So what we try and do is speak to local Labour parties in those areas and find our members there and supply them with materials and encourage the local Labour Party to get involved. And actually, that works out better both for us and for the local community, because it means it's not just us travelling to somewhere, it's people in the local community getting involved and building up links with the LGBT community in that area, and that's something we'll be working on over the next year. Obviously we work on a lot of policy issues. During the period where Labour was in government, we spent a lot of time kind of lobbying, working with ministers to make sure that the kind of legislative changes happened. We've been adjusting, like the rest of the Labour Party, to dealing with opposition and working with a coalition, which I think took us all by surprise. So working out how that works, but actually making sure we challenge the government where we think they're wrong, where we think they're doing enough, but actually also working with Delga. I haven't quite got my head around this yet. So it's LGBT plus Lib Dems and LGBT Tory where we've got similar ground, and you know we do meet as different groups occasionally just to kind of talk about policy issues to make sure, you know, because there is obviously a lot of common ground where we can work together to push things forward. We do a fair degree of international work too. As I said, Michael Cashman, who is outgoing MP in the European Parliament, is one of our patrons. We do a lot of work with him. He is vice chair of something in the European Parliament called the Intergroup, which is a kind of cross-party group. And if you're on Twitter, you may have seen them. They do quite a lot of good work, particularly around Eastern Europe, challenging some of the stuff I'm sure you all have heard about, particularly in some of those Eastern European countries where there's real problems around prides and oppression, and I'm sure you'll have heard of things going on in Russia. So we kind of work through him and through other groups like ILGA, which is a big European campaign on promoting LGBT rights, and we also work with charities and non-governmental organisations to try and push the agenda around Africa and some of those countries. And through the Labour Party we kind of have links with our sister groups in other Labour parties around the world. So we've been doing quite a lot of work with Rainbow Labour in Australia, where they're having a kind of big debate coming up to a vote in the Australian Labour Party to try and get policy on equal marriage and get that through the Australian Parliament. So we've been kind of working with them, giving them a bit of support. And we meet up once a year with the kind of sister groups in Europe through a network called Rainbow Rose, which is the kind of LGBT group for all the kind of Labour, Socialist and Social Democratic parties in the European Parliament. So the German Social Democrats and the French Socialists and the Dutch Labour Party, which is quite nice to kind of get some support and find out ideas and use that as well. So we have kind of an international campaign as well as a domestic one. And we're an entirely voluntary group. Unfortunately, we'd like to have some more money and some staff. That would be a help because our workers is expanded. But we're run by a group of volunteers of about 17 of us. We have some kind of regional committees as well. So one in the West Midlands, in the North West. We just set up in Scotland and the East Midlands and Yorkshire's about. So that, unfortunately, South East is a bit tricky because it's a weird-shaped region with no middle to it. But we're trying to set up some kind of local groups there, perhaps around Brighton, around Oxford and Reading, to try and get a bit more work done here. But there is also quite an active London group too. So we're trying to do stuff on the ground locally and engage in the way we can there. And our funding, as I say, we don't get funding, it's all through membership fees of our members, but also through affiliations, because we work wider than the Labour Party, work within the kind of wider Labour movement. So most of the large trade unions, LGBT groups affiliate to us, as does Labour students, and a number of university Labour clubs, and about 60 or 70 local constituency Labour parties. So the local Labour parties in the areas kind of pay £15 to affiliate, which gives us a lot of money, also gives us kind of access to being held to help on a local basis and give that kind of community feel. And I will shut up burbling on at you now so you can ask some questions.
Do you want to pick people to speak?
We've all heard that. Both in me and your owl.
Any more questions?
God, we've stunned them into silence.
I'll start if no one else is. You mentioned about the equal marriage. It's like to both of you, you know, what is your, I mean, you've set out your policy, but what's your policies on like civil marriage, and especially like with the religious element, you know, because there's the whole debate in Scotland at the minute going on. Like, would you bring it down to England and Wales as well, like for both of you, kind of?
Can you just start short?
As our
Short
policy.
consultation.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, I mean, there are two things here. One, there's a Liberal Democrat policy, and two, there's a coalition policy. And I'm sure you're all aware of that. Liberal Democrat policy is very clear. There are three elements to it, and yes, we do want to have civil and religious, and also to ensure that trans people are able to not have to go through this awful procedure of divorcing and then remarrying, because that's just totally unfair. That is Liberal Democrats' policy. Currently, the government's policy is based on civil coalition and civil equal marriage, but civil marriage, not religious marriage, at the moment. So that's the difference. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there's a consultation that starts in March. If lots of religious organisations come forward and say, yes, we want to have it as well, then great. But that's the bit that's not guaranteed. We obviously are encouraging everybody to put forward their views, and especially from those parts of the coalition policy, which is slightly different to the Liberal Democrat policy, but that's where it stands at the moment. So we'll be fighting on all corners, and obviously we will still be pushing our government to do all the things in Liberal Democrat policy, and not just what's in the coalition.
In terms of LGBT Labour's policy, we passed it a couple of years ago, and it's clear we support equal civil marriage, but we also support civil partnerships for straight couples too.
Yeah.
And we've just taken part in the Scottish Government's consultation, which is closing in about 8-9 days' time, and kind of put that forward too. And as you may know, there's a leadership election going on for the Scottish Labour Party, a leadership and deputy leadership election following the elections up there. And so we've been raising that with the candidates there and getting a commitment from all of them that they will support it too, which is exactly the same process we did last year for the National Labour Party leadership election, which is how we kind of got an endorsement from all the leadership candidates and got Ed Miliband's backing for that. And it works slightly differently because obviously the way policy works in the Liberal Democrats and the way it works in Labour and actually the Tories is the kind of policy and the conference of the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party, who also have a policy, is much more that, you know, the party conference makes the policy and that's what dictates things. Actually, in the Labour Party, it's much more important to have the shadow cabinet and the leader on board, because passing something on the Labour Party conference doesn't necessarily mean it ends up in the manifesto. There's a kind of whole range of things like something called the National Policy Forum, the National Executive Committee. So actually our work has been kind of winning that over, which obviously we have done, and you know, we've got endorsements from Ed Miliband. So in terms of how Labour MPs will vote and what the Labour Party's position will be if this comes up to a vote in Parliament, is that they'll be voting in favour of marriage. Now, we've still got some discussions to do about making sure we get the kind of necessary support over civil partnerships, extending that as well. And as I understand it, the consultation is not going to be about civil partnerships for straight people, and there's going to be no discussion or consultation on gay marriage in a religious setting. So we're going to end up with this slightly strange situation if it's passed on the way the consultation is, in that you'll be able to have a religious civil partnership but not a religious marriage, but you'll be able to have either a civil marriage or a, which is going to be slightly weird, in that you'll get these strange options that you can have a civil partnership or a marriage, but not only a civil partnership in church, which seems slightly weird if you want to. So I think there's going to be a flaw. I'm hoping that will be flushed out during the consultation when everyone realises how bloody daft it looks, because it just doesn't make sense. Our concern in terms of the consultation is that it isn't actually happening yet. And I can see him grinning at me already because he's heard me say this before. In that it's been announced 3 times, and every time it gets announced as a new thing, it's actually a re-announcement, and it's still not happening until February, March, because it was originally announced last February. Yeah. Then we got to July, and it was moved back to the autumn. We got to the autumn, it was moved to the spring. So I'm being slightly cynical and wondering if we're going to get to the spring and find it's going to go back to the summer. He's shaking his head, but
it's like being extremely cross. I don't think
your ministers might be extremely cross, but you're only one half of this coalition, and I suspect the other half have more problems than you do when it comes to the vote. Yeah. And it's probably unfair because there should be a Tory sat here and there isn't. But they're going to have real trouble when it comes to Parliament. They are not, it doesn't matter that David Cameron stood up and made it in his conference speech, and they had a lovely time announcing it. Their MPs ain't going to vote for it. Lots of them just are not going to vote for it. We're already seeing problems in the House of Lords. I don't know if people are aware of this, that over civil partnerships in religious buildings. As you may know, there was something called the Alley Amendment, which was passed as part of the Equality Act just at the tail end of the Labour government, which Lynn Featherstone, for the Equalities Minister, work on the regulations which are being introduced. A Tory peer called Baroness O'Caffeine, who is a particularly narrow-minded and unpleasant woman, and you happily recall that. I've said worse in the press, is found some obscure, archaic device to do with prayers, I believe. Don't ask me to explain it, I don't understand it, where she can now force a debate. So although the Lords have debated this and passed it, and it's part of the Equalities Act, it's just the regulations of how it will work in practice that are being done, she's found a way to reopen the debate and reopen the vote to try and scupper all this. And if you want to know a little bit of her history, there was a woman called Baroness Young, who any of you know kind of LGBT history may have heard of, some I see people nodding, who was the kind of forefront of campaigning against an equal age of consent and keeping Section 28, and she was kind of the woman who led everything that was utterly bigoted in the House of Lords. And on her deathbed kind of had Baroness O'Caffeine there saying, "You must carry on." So this baton of bigotry has been passed over, and suddenly her coffin has opened and back she comes, and now she's doing this. But I think this is a shot across our bows. I wonder if we weren't talking about gay marriage, whether she'd have made the effort. She probably would, because she's unpleasant. But I think this is a shot across bows, and I think there's been a lot of discussion about, next thing's gay marriage. It's not. Civil partnerships were really, really difficult. Everyone forgets how bloody difficult it was, because there were lots and lots of people who just don't like us. And they're all going to re-emerge and find a whole range of excuses they use. And so I think gay marriage is really difficult. So I think this thing in 2 weeks' time of religious civil partnerships, which should be straightforward, it is kind of a warning sign. And there's stuff in the press today about the Catholic churches, Scotland, on the consultation there. So I think that it's going to be a fight.
Any questions?
Yeah. From a Pride in Canterbury point of view, I think you know that we've been going for 8 years now, and we've kept hitting a brick wall, basically. I suppose really I'm asking for a bit of reassurance, because I know Adam's experienced a lot of the difficulties that we've had of just writing letters and whatever and not getting replies. Have you any clear way of how to take that forward, how to make some contact that is actually going to get results? Because I was talking to someone just yesterday, and I was saying the problems that we have, and they said, it's not just you, it's not just Pride in Canterbury, it's Canterbury. And I do feel that people think now, yeah, we've got civil partnerships, and that probably people in Parliament say, oh, what are groups like that making a fuss about? But, there isn't a scene down here, and there isn't a sense of gay pride, and there needs to be. And we desperately need a way to see how somehow people like you can chip away at that and make some progress.
I think there's a degree of kind of finding out. I think you're kind of finding out what the problem is. Is it a council leader? Is it the council per se? Is it so knowing exactly what the particular issues and chip away at that? I think actually there's quite an easy way, is just to humiliate them. If they really, for 8 years, won't talk, won't answer letters, won't do anything, let's just embarrass them into it. Because frankly, I think you're right when you talk about civil partnerships and people in Parliament saying, oh, well, lots of it's sorted. But I think because all that happened, there's been a lot of change in attitudes in society, which is much more open to this, and much more accepting and much more tolerant than we were 10, 15 years ago. And actually, when you find out these things are still going on, people who, about 10 years ago, might not have been supportive are kind of shocked. And so I think actually there's a degree of shining a light on it, and actually making sure people outside of your area and using us. And I think given that it's a Tory council, using the Tory group as well. Because I know there are lots of people who are kind of the Tories, if only they'd go away and leave us alone. But actually, they're in government and they're running councils. Tory councillors are never going to listen to me. I can run campaigns and have nice demos outside and humiliate them in the press and put out press releases. But the people who they are actually going to be able to talk to and have the access is going to be the Tory group. So in a strange way, you do need a group from each of the parties, because there are always places where different parties are in office, and you need that group to be able to do the backroom access that we just can't do. So I think there's a twin track to that.
Yeah, I just to be clear, I think what I'm saying is, yes, I agree with embarrassment, and we are trying that, because we give awards every year, which is just partly just to draw attention to ourselves, and we tried to keep them very positive. But last year we introduced, based on a Peter Tatchell quote, the Dead Canary Award, and we presented that to the Chief Executive, and it did get publicity, but this year nothing significant has happened. So what I'm asking is, can you give us, can you or someone you know be helpful in doing that embarrassing? Because, you know, I
can see a press release with what's Canterbury got against gays or something like
that. It would be interesting to know whether this event is going to be, whether a press release has gone out about this event.
Well, I mean, this is why, I mean, we've been twittering as we've come down this evening, deliberately to say, look, we're coming to Canterbury.
Because they're quite sympathetic.
Yeah, so I mean, if we can try and do something press-wise, we'll definitely look into doing that. I think it also boils down to some other strategic points as well. I mean, I know that you've written letters to Deputy Prime Minister and the opposition and various other people. Those people will get those letters, and then they'll come to us two and say, what's going on? Now, the advantage we have this time is we actually know from yourselves beforehand that there is a problem. And I mean, though I've already made tracks in various places here to try and solve the issue, which hasn't happened yet, it is a question of, and especially Matthew as well, who can't be here, but we all three of us then need to clamour and say that something has to be done, because if it's a party thing, it's seen as, oh, well, you know, it's obviously a Tory council, so us two will obviously have a go at them. But if all three of us are on board, then there is a way that we're doing this cross-party unity thing, which doesn't seem politically taking the heat out of the political sort of fire for it, makes it a lot easier. So, I mean, I think that's one point that we can take back and talk to Matthew as well.
And we could talk to, you know, I have to confess I don't know what the breakdown of the councils are here, but certainly talk to the opposition, you know, the Lib Dem councillors and the Labour councillors, and hopefully make sure they're being supportive and doing what they can. But also as well, we can use, I know some of our MPs, and certainly Michael Cashman is always up for a good fight. He loves it. You know, and basically you just wheel him out to Canterbury and say he's in the European Parliament. Used to be on EastEnders. That always gets people. He has always gets that. You know, it's a joy. You can get him in anything because he used to be on EastEnders. You know? Which, you know, he uses freely as well. So I mean, he'd be happy to do that kind of thing. So certainly send us the stuff and we'll look at what we can do to help.
We'll possibly also arrange an event well in advance next year, so we can all have, you know, time to plan for it and actually get one MP from each of the parties down or something like that. Even if it's a small event here at the university, for instance, I'm sure that, you know, that way more you know, press and influence can be made of it. In that way, councillors who perhaps think, you know, we're not going to bother to do this issue, it's not top of our priority, we'll see 3 MPs coming down here, and then that might get their attention. So there's things about between yourselves here in the university and Pride of Canterbury, you possibly could work together on something to come up with some kind of, it doesn't have to be a big event, but a smallish event that we could come down to and bring an MP down and see if that will get the press to notice the problem that we have here.
I mean, Chester just did their first ever Pride, and they did it on the university campus because they didn't have anywhere else to hold it, and so the student union helped out. Because, you know, student unions are always very supportive on these things. But ultimately, if you're feeling really bolshy, hold the parade through the centre of Canterbury anyway.
We did that in 2005.
Oh, you've done that?
Yeah, I've done that.
How many people did you have?
It was counted by a Labour councillor for us on the march, and we were over 500.
And that still didn't shift at all?
And over 2,000 in the event in the park during the day.
But the problem was, people acknowledged that it was a great day, and we've had the traders contacting us and saying, when are you going to hold another one? But we didn't get the people, the community coming together and saying, we want to make something of this day. And how many, basically 6 of us,
4 to 6 of us, yeah,
did organise the first day, and then about the same the second, and that didn't grow, and we were just too exhausted by the time we'd done those 2. And also we felt that Pride in Canterbury has wider aims, which is to bring culture, LGBT culture to the area, and not just one day a year. And so we wanted to concentrate on that as well.
Did any local councillors come to that event?
Yes. Alex Perkins and from your party, and Julia C. Labour.
Okay. Alex,
we
it does ring a bell.
as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what I was just
I think
wondering.
if you kind of send as much detail as you can, and then we'll look at what we can do to help.
But I think it needs to be.
We've got a lot on our website of the
Oh right, well I'll have a
yeah.
look. I'll have a look.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Go on.
Sort of like a different tax, but how do you see LGBT issues in sports, and what is the next step for progressing LGBT issues in sports?
Well, there we go first. He's the sporting.
I happen. I'm also vice captain of the Irons Gay Golf Society for the UK. Which
I can forgive him being a Liberal Democrat. I can't forgive him being a golfer.
And also same-sex dance participants as well. So sport is one of my favourite pastimes. I'm a big football fan. Chelsea for my sins, I'm Norwich City, so I thought that might bring a few boos out. So, I mean, the government has sent out this new charter, which you hopefully will have seen, about combating homophobia and transphobia in sport, which Rugby Football League has really taken up very well. The rugby league teams have signed up a lot. Unfortunately, the football teams haven't. And it is a really big challenge to get our football terraces to be free of homophobic and transphobic comments. I periodically go to Chelsea, and I have to admit I sit there and hear them, and I don't like them at all, which puts me going off to football completely. But if we're going to do anything, we need to have, again, it's about coordinating campaigns for this. Government's leading from a starting point, which is great, but there are other organisations like Pride Sports, which I don't know if you might have heard of, based up in the northwest, and UK LGBT Sports Network, which I'm also a member of as well, which is trying to get communities around sport from an LGBT perspective to get together to increase the knowledge and understanding and spread the word that, you know, LGBT people love sport and there shouldn't be a barrier to partaking or being a spectator. There is also, you might not know, there is at the Olympics next year, 2012, there's actually going to be a Pride House, which is going to be an LGBT sports space for spectators and participants to all join during the London Olympics. Now that's being announced formally next Friday, but that is a sort of a creation from the Vancouver Winter Olympics, where they had the first ever LGBT space, or Pride, or house is what they call it, there. So I think the more sort of media attention and general sort of seeing what can be done to make sure sport's more visible, and also making sure that the fans and the spectators behave themselves, which is some football clubs are putting in some ways of people texting in the grounds anonymously, so they don't have to confront it themselves, but they actually do it behind the scenes, and then the security people actually look and watch and things like that. And I'm afraid we also have to make sure our players do better. I'm afraid the comments on the field, yes, it's a heated football match, yes, people say things they possibly shouldn't say, but they still shouldn't say them in the first place. And that goes for race, religion, and sexuality, whatever it is. So it's a matter of education and keep campaigning on it, and it has to be stamped out. It's the last real bastion of homophobic and transphobic comments in sport has got to be sorted.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with everything Adrian said, really, but it's always sport lags behind everything else, and it did on race, but in football it's always been particularly bad, and lots of work was done on racism in football, and there's still lots to do, but it's so much further forward than it was even 10, 15, 20 years ago, certainly in the 80s. And so I think if they can learn the lessons of some of the stuff they've done in that, as I say, there's lots more to do with homophobia, then they'll make some progress. I mean, the annoying thing is, we know there are Premiership footballers who are gay. We know there are Premiership footballers who are gay and out to their friends and their family, just not out publicly. It's going to have to be somebody who's brave enough to take the first step, in the knowledge that some of the others might actually back them up. And I find it really annoying when I see Max Clifford. I mean, I find it annoying seeing Max Clifford anyway, but I find it annoying seeing Max Clifford saying, you know, he advises his football clients not to. Actually, he would be being much more helpful if he advised his out footballer clients to come out as a group, sit 5 of them down at a press conference, preferably from different teams, and actually you would make a giant leap forward in one go. And if there were 5, because actually the more you get, the easier it is. I mean, politics is perhaps a similar example in that it took a while. You know, Chris Smith came out in the 80s, and it took a while after that. But what happened in '97 was you had 2 Labour MPs elected openly. Within 2 weeks, 3 other Labour MPs who had been in the closet came out. By the time we got to the 3rd one, nobody noticed. Poor David Borrow was on about page 27, so he was bored at that point. But you know, it just took somebody to take the step, and then other people. And once you've got the ball rolling, and now at the point where actually, you know, we like to know, and we like people to be open, and there's still problems, and there are still closeted members of Parliament, and people who stand who won't come out. But we've moved on so from where 20 years ago, actually, it was a resigning thing from government. So I think we can take hope from those things that will happen in sport, but it lags behind. I was slightly ironic that football is the worst giving, and that's the one where they spend their entire time hugging and snogging each other. I mean, it's the one sport where men are basically allowed to grope each other outside of a rugby scrum. Yeah, it's the one with the most male affection, in a way that, you know, if they did it in a pub, they'd all be kind of hitting each other. But there's the sport you are not allowed to be gay in. But it's across all sports. I mean, you know, think about how many sportsmen and women you can name who are out. I mean, I can't remember how many people take part in the Olympics. It's in the athletes, about 12 or 13,000. Was it 10, 15 out competitors in the last Olympics, of which 14 were women and 1 was a man? Because it's slightly easier to come out as a woman, because if you're a bit butcher looking, then you are anyway, and all these kind of hideous cliches. You know, but it is absurd.
I just wanted to just add on, there's something else. You might have heard of the Football versus Homophobia campaign, the Justin campaign, which is based in Brighton. But they do a great amount of work, and they have a regular sort of yearly sort of trying to do something on February the 19th, which is in celebration of Justin Fashion, who is a former Norwich City player as well. Yeah, that campaign is really trying to drive home the message that all football clubs need to do something on this. So if you're interested in getting involved a bit more, that might be something to look at.
Yeah, the Justin campaign is worth looking into. It's interesting. I say they're based in Brighton, but Brighton Football Club recently has just complained to the FA about the amount of abuse their players, and I'm based in Brighton, so I kind of know how this goes on. The amount of abuse their players and their fans, because you know, Brighton's seen as not entirely straight, you know, entirely a myth. But you know, but the result is, you know, everyone who supports Brighton is gay, and therefore it is free rein to just hurl abuse at them. And you know, it just got to a point actually now where the club say can't possibly, you know, this can't possibly be acceptable to anyone.
Any other questions?
I just wondered what your party views were on gender-neutral passports.
You can, because I don't know what our position is. Which probably answers my question. I suspect we haven't got a position.
I don't think we haven't got an official position either, but I know that the government is starting to look at gender-neutral passports, and it's something that, particularly for the trans community, it would be, you know, much more simpler to have those type of passports than having, you know, male, female, and then another box or other or whatever else. So that's, you know. So as far as I'm aware, that's something that we are looking at, and I totally agree with you. It's something that ought to be done. So that's as far as I can go on that one. But
it's not something we've campaigned or looked particularly at, and I suspect the party probably hasn't. It's something we can do.
Any other questions?
I've got one if no one else has. If you were in government with your own party, not in a coalition, because you guys seem to be push to the side of it. But if you had it, what would be your one main priority apart from like what we talked about earlier about marriage? What would be your one main priority on LGBT issues?
Schools, bullying in schools. My worry about marriage is it excludes every other bit of the debate, and it kind of it steals all the limelight. And important as it is to people, the difference it makes from civil partnerships is smaller than the difference sorting out homophobic bullying in schools would make, and the effect that has on people both in terms of school and the rest of their life, and effect on that. So for me, if you kind of have my magic wand to solve one thing, it's the way schools deal with bullying and issues around LGBT issues. And Schools Out, if you're not aware of them, I hope most people are, do some fantastic work on this, and led by a redoubtable woman called Sue Sanders, who's been doing this since the mid-70s, well before anyone else was interested or it was fashionable or easy to do, and is a remarkable woman who has forced this onto the agenda. But that would be, I think, that you would make such a difference to so many people's lives in one go.
I'm trying to think of something that we haven't covered, I have to say. And one is mental health issues. A number of young LGBT people that commit suicide, which then probably stems from homophobic, transphobic bullying, but it's the health services getting them to understand just how much of a serious problem it is, and identifying those causes, which drug abuse and suicide and all the things that come from having a mental health condition which is affected by those sort of issues. I think it's something that we as a country find it's a sort of an area where people don't want to talk about, and I'm afraid government's very good at sort of putting complicated or difficult areas into boxes and say, oh, we'll put those to a side, a bit like the drugs issue, same sort of thing. So for me that would be mental health and sort of the issues of drugs within LGBT society as well.
I have a question on that. On the schools issue as well, I saw a study that was conducted in Yorkshire a couple of weeks ago that was found that it found something like 70% of schools in the area around Yorkshire in general had been asking their LGBT students to change in a different room from the rest of the group. Found teachers have been making homophobic comments to their students. One saying that if she had a teacher saying that if they had a gay son, they would take them to the garden and shoot them. There's clearly a massive issue in schools as it is about how they treat LGBT issues. But what do you think that the government can and should be doing to make it better? Because obviously there's a clear lack of clear policy on it, and some schools are very good at what they do, some schools really tackle it head on, but some just seem to just hide from it completely and let their staff do whatever they want without having official policy. What do you think the government could do to change that sort of issue?
Yeah, I saw the survey you're talking about, and doing this role, I kind of see a lot of stuff that kind of, but that particular, I just kind of was slightly open-mouthed that this kind of thing was going on. I mean, when I was at school, I had more trouble from teachers than I ever did from pupils. Now, I was now. I mean, I left school at 18 in 1993, so we were kind of pre lots of the reforms, so you just didn't come out before you left school because it was easier. But by the time I got to sixth form, there was kind of a few clues, and people kind of guess as the way they do. But actually, some of the teachers were worse than but they weren't open in that sense. I look back now and realise why they didn't like me and were particularly unpleasant. But I just actually open mouthed that that is, I think, is anywhere near acceptable. I think in terms of state schools, that's very easy. You can rule that, you can outlaw that, you can issue guidance to schools on how to deal with it, you can introduce proper training for teachers on handling it, and I suspect in a lot of cases, it's just some teachers just don't know how to deal with it and blunder into it. And so there should be proper training. And you can outlaw things like that. I mean, frankly, a teacher who says that to people shouldn't be teaching anybody, anything. The kind of person who tells a child that if I had a child like you be shot, sod off and do a different job. You're not helping children in any way, shape or form. But one of the things Schools Out's done, and I think has been particularly valuable, is to They say normalise and they don't like the word, but basically just introduce it into subjects. So there is no kind of, this is the gay lesson in part of your kind of your social education stuff. It kind of just becomes, so if you're doing a lesson about computing, you talk about Alan Turing. It was fantastic, I mentioned last week, and the fact he's gay is part of it. You're doing a drama lesson, well, don't hide the fact that some of our greatest actors are gay, and just it becomes part of everyday life. And this has been done in the really good example is Stoke Newington School in North London, who have done a lot of this work, and it works. Their bullying has gone away, and they've solved a lot of the problems they've had before, and managed to. They're a real example of how it works. I mean, it's been a great advantage for us because Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, who also has the Equalities Brief for Labour, her children happen to go there. So she's seen it in action. So she's actually seen it and understands it. So actually when we talk to her about it, we've got a big step forward and we've got somebody who understands it on a practical level rather than having to explain it, which is a happy coincidence in life, which has helped us and then we don't have to kind of do the persuading that perhaps we were seeing. But I think that kind of thing, I think, one of the things that was happening just before, and we should have done it earlier, was we were changing the rules on sex education just before we lost the general election. And part of that was making sex education compulsory, which covers a whole range of other issues around the rise in STIs and HIV diagnosis. But it also included talking about relationship education and that awful word of normalising, including get LGBT issues within it. So there would have been, you would have learnt about it. And obviously the usual suspects got worked out, and unfortunately it was that point where at the very end we were going to lose the entire Education Act because of it, and it got lost, mainly through opposition from the Conservatives in the House of Lords, which comes back to that issue around the marriage stuff and why we've got a fight on our hands. But that would have made a huge difference, and I think if you can get that kind of stuff back in and get it into schools, it will make a difference. And government in state schools can make a real practical difference.
I can't add much more to that, but I would also, I suppose, take it down to another level away from government, and that's down to the local government areas, because I think there is an issue here about sort of localism to some extent, and if you come from, as I come from Norfolk, which is a bit out of the way, then possibly teachers in those sort of areas might not understand what they should be teaching as they should be. Whilst if you're in a city like London or Birmingham or Leeds or Liverpool, there may be more understanding of issues. So I think there's also an issue about making sure that across the country these issues are fully understood by teachers and how to deal with those sort of issues in a sensible, respectful manner. And obviously the incident you gave is horrendous. I mean, it's unacceptable in all ways and means, whatever one could possibly say. And I'm afraid, I just hope that's an isolated area that happens and it's not happening throughout the country. But I wouldn't have said Yorkshire is particularly rural to the same extent Norfolk or Cornwall.
I think it's specifically South Yorkshire, which is obviously the
like
metropolitan area. If it was North Yorkshire, you might kind of went down to rural schools, but I was nasty feeling it was kind of Sheffield, isn't it?
Well, that's even worse. So I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, it's something that we both have to campaign on and make sure it's eradicated.
Charlotte, you had a question before?
What do you think of the It Gets Better campaign in America, and is there any sort of desire to do a similar sort of thing over here?
There's been a little bit going on because Stonewall have been doing some of it, and they've kind of imported some of the stuff across and been doing their own version, but it's been slightly lower key because of a funding issue. But it seems to work, and I think if it kind of, it's one of those things again. If you can make use of celebrities and famous people, actually people then sort of sit up and think twice about it. It comes back to that discussion we had about sports stars coming out. It just kind of actually, because I've always found that a lot of people is either I don't like gays and go, well, well, you're different. Am I why? And just carry on. My response, carry on as normal. If they like you, they're going to have trouble kind of disliking it because there's one facet they don't see, and the It Gets Better campaign kind of feeds into that. So there is a bit of it going on here, and I'm sure it will continue, but Stonewall will be
I mean, there's lots of campaigns, especially in the US. You may get sort of emails signing petitions and things like that, All Out, and there are other ones as well. And they all have that effect that they just bring that to the fore, and again through significant personalities taking part in it, that gets to run in the media, and Stonewall, do it as a smaller, but they do lots of other campaigns as well on the same sort of issues. So but it's a good, anything like that is a good thing. So.
Questions?
I had an experience the other day. We kind of covered national issues and policy and so forth. I was at my friend's house the other day taking a break from the exhausting life of being a student.
I remember it well. It was terrible.
I don't remember that.
That was just the essays. Anyway, so there, and I was talking to a friend, and we were just watching a film, and I just say, mention what I've been up to, catching up with her. And at one point I said, I've got this talk today, which is the LGBT question time. And she kind of stops halfway through. It was a very, very, very weird look. And she said, what are you doing with the LGBT law? So we've covered a lot of kind of issues of homophobia nationally, and kind of, I kind of struggle to find exactly kind of what to say, because it's not, kind of from my family life, it's never, people do what they want. You don't judge people on what they do. In terms of their own private life, that's fine. All the more power to people. So I was kind of stuck with not really knowing what to say, because her reaction was kind of just like, oh my God, it was LGBT or no, the kind of big boogeyman or whatever. And I was just kind of staggered to find someone I thought is my friend, having such kind of a big aura. I didn't pry into it because I didn't want to go into too much depth at that particular moment. But again, what would you recommend, or how would you recommend kind of overcoming homophobia in a much more kind of a localized setting, or one with to people you might know, rather than just kind of looking at issues nationally? So literally, how do you kind of tackle that kind of thing, either on the doorstep where you're campaigning, or with people you know meet down the pub? What do you say to them? Kind of just what you guys were just interested to hear.
Someone said to me the other day, you don't come out, there's all stories about how you come out, but actually you don't come out once, you come out repeatedly every time you meet someone new, because there's always an assumption made. And I have to say I've been fairly lucky in recent years that when anyone has asked me if I'm married and do I have a girlfriend, I've kind of said no, the world seems to have moved on enough, or places I've worked and lived, as it's not an issue, but certainly I've had it in the past. I remember when as I say, I went to university in, you're going to look at me like I'm ancient again now, in 1993, and I kind of gave this myth, I was going to leave, I grew up in a small town in kind of southeast where you didn't come out. People left and went to university because then they could come out. And you go to university because that's where everyone's liberal and open-minded and broad-minded there. And I got there and they weren't. Lots of them weren't. There's this grey myth, and it can be a bit of a shock. And I decided to say sod it, because frankly I was fed up with being in the closet, and I told my friends, and I kind of nipped back home just to tell my parents, just to make sure I could go somewhere if they weren't okay, and they were, and it was fine. And I just came across these people kind of completely narrow-minded, and I decided to say sod it and carry on, because actually they liked me before, and if they're not going to like me over that, I probably don't want to spend any time with them, and they'll get over it. But I've moved on. I suppose I moved on from that to kind of say, it depends how the question was phrased, but I would answer the question on why I'm going to the LGBT group in exactly the same way I'd answer the question, why? Well, I didn't know you're in the rugby club. Answer it in the same way. My view is treat it as normal. The problem is theirs, not yours. And if they want a further question, and you might perhaps follow up with did you not know I was gay? How did you not guess? Then it's a question to them, and then they kind of go, how did I not guess? I'm not saying you're horribly camp and really obvious, but you know what I mean. It's kind of, it turns it round to them and actually says, well, I'm not hiding anything here or pretending to be anything, or I'm comfortable in my own skin.
James, the last time you hear, but Vidge straight.
Sorry, there you are, I made an assumption. Just goes to prove it.
Yeah.
Well, there you are, that makes it even easier. You say, because I'm supportive and not a horrible bigot. Which also turns it around and so now I've outed you. Now turned out to be a budding Premiership footballer. I've probably made a career, but That sort of answered your question, but in the wrong way around.
As for me, it has to be quite a different story to James's, in the sense that I actually came out here at university when I was a second year student. But I never came out to my parents for another 6 years. When I then went back very briefly home, and then I came to London and spent 3 or 4 years in London before I decided to tell my parents. So my experience of being bullied in my first year here, knowing I was gay, knowing a long time ago that I was. So my advice is slightly different, in the sense that yes, you have to be who you are, and if you have the confidence and the, I suppose, audacity to say to that person, yes, I am gay, what's your problem about it, then fine. But in my case, I didn't have that confidence, I have to say, and I only have that talking to you now, but if you'd asked me to do this 10 years ago, I would never have done it. So at that point, you then have to find out who your really best friends are, and you possibly tell one person who you feel particularly close to, who you've known for a long period of time. Possibly not even someone at university, but possibly an old friend from school, who you're still in touch with and you're getting on very well with, and you're thinking about, can I tell them? Or if you are at university and you think there's someone who you've really got to know, and they know, you play football, whatever you do in your spare time with them, and you think, do I trust this person enough to tell them? And if you don't think you do, you don't tell them. You wait until the moment that you do feel that you have enough trust in that person to tell them that. And if they decide that they don't like you after it, well, they aren't a good enough friend to be your friend. And that's how I learned from it. And there were people who were friends of mine in the first year who weren't friends of mine in the second year. And I learned to forget about them, because that's what you have to do in times as it goes.
Yeah, I think that's kind of awesome. You have to do what works for you.
Yeah.
Not everyone is a gobby bullshit git as I am. So, but curiously, what did you say?
Well, no, I mean, I just kind of cut, because it wasn't anything explicit. It was just kind of a look like, ooh, and I was like, well, I've got friends who were part of the group and I do support them. That was basically it. She kind of.
But see, now I know you're straight. It makes me wonder. She's thinking, you're straight.
Because after that, she sort of skirted it, and I didn't force the issue at the time. But it's something that I probably will come back to at some point, which is like.
It's a discussion point for
yeah.
If you at some point.
Because she's still quite, I say quite religious, but she's kind of church going. She's always had kind of, I say conservative with a little c kind of views on kind of family.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, that was the kind of thing you learn that actually when you get to university, there's a myth about students, isn't there? You know, you're all kind of, so everyone's kind of, you know, out there on demos burning things, and you know, it kind of went away a bit. It was, when I went to university, it was everyone was kind of harking back to 1968, and that's how students were. And you've probably gone of that reputation has resumed over the last year with demos and things. But actually, when you get here, students are like everybody else. They're an absolute mix of the population of political views and opinions, and you will find people who have just never met anybody different before, and it's going to take them time to adjust. You know, they'll come from rural areas where they've only met 4 people because they're in the middle of nowhere. But you know, I'm being exaggerating. You know what I mean? But you know, so actually, university's meant to be about kind of, you know, learning things. That's a learning process in itself, really, actually. Help people along with it. If they come out the other end, they haven't learned anything broadened their mind, they've wasted for 3 years.
They always add on to that. The fascinating thing is 2 of the 3 bullies that I faced in the first year both came out as gay after they left university. So sometimes it's the people who bully are bullying for another reason.
Yeah.
So always bear that in mind.
Always a lot of that. Yeah. Just have to look at American politicians. Yeah. The ones who are most homophobic are always the ones found on their knees with a ring.
Bacon said that one.
I don't care.
Any other questions?
What do you think can be done by the government to improve the rights of LGBT people on a more international level?
You can go first, I'll keep talking.
I mean, I think one of the things I mentioned in the early introduction was about the aid budget, which we are doing. It's 0.7% of our GDP that we spend on international aid, and the way of funding countries which do treat people with no respect whatsoever, I think personally, we should think carefully about how we do fund those countries. And one way of doing that is within the settings of international aid, there has to be some kind of requirement for human rights. One of those human rights is treating LGBT people with the same respect and tolerance that they would expect in every other country. But taking away slightly from the government, there is a body called Kaleidoscope, which I'm sure James and I have both heard of, and I wonder if some of you have as well, which is a new body that's been set up really to promote international LGBT rights across the world. It has various patrons who are, again, it's the important personalities making a stand on these sort of issues. I mean, government can always do so much, but there is a limitation at government level where, possibly our Prime Minister goes and meets various African Prime Ministers like Robert Mugabe, and they're not going to listen. Even if they're in that conversation, I doubt very much that they'll take any notice of what David Cameron said. So it has to be from the bottom up, i.e. the actual local people and the communities within those countries have to understand that those LGBT rights are important, and they have to make movements within their own countries rather than always relying on Western, UK, US to come over and tell them what to do, because a lot of those countries don't actually like that either. So we have to play it in a very sensible way. Yes, we have to campaign for them and help them, but yes, they also have to grow their own roots within their own countries so that they actually change the face of those countries in their own way, rather than being sort of colonial sort of diktat from Western states. So there's two ways of looking at that. There's also the EU, and the EU is, whatever we think of the European Union, it's extremely important. It has a very good intergroup and LGBT rights and discussions on that level. So in particular in places like Russia, which you may have seen at the moment with the cancelling of St. Petersburg Pride and this new legislation about not being able to speak about lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans issues in St. Petersburg or Russia generally, as something that we can lobby on as both as our individual parties, but also through Liberal International, which is a sort of a body that encompasses all liberal parties across the world, part of one of the Human Rights Committee groups, where we lobby the respective countries to make sure their laws are within the UN Convention on Human Rights and the Council of Europe and their conventions as well. So it's a lot of it is lobbying and campaigning, which we do to a lesser extent whenever we can, but it is something that has been noted that hasn't been done enough on. Stonewall have also taken on the baton to look at international issues rather than just focusing on English, Welsh, UK issues. So I think that's the three different ways I'd come at it from it.
Yeah, I mean, we have some concerns over the aid issue, which I think some of them are now being picked up, and there's been a bit of change of policy, because what was rushed out was an announcement that there was not going to be aid to countries that were homophobic. And actually the immediate response from the charities who worked in that area and the LGBT groups in Uganda, Nigeria and Ghana was actually, for God's sake, don't say that, we're going to be scapegoats. And that's already been seen in Mugabe kind of making speeches about it. That seems to have been picked up by government, thank God. And they seem to have worked out that there needs to be a much more nuanced approach than just doing it kind of a big blunt hand. It's basically they'll tell them, we've got less money, it's your fault, which was what was starting to happen, which was really terrifying of the LGBT communities in those countries, who are pretty brave people to be out campaigning in the first place, when actually execution awaits some of them, potentially. But that seems to have been picked up by the government, thankfully. Our other concern, which has been clarified now, was that this was going to be a way of cutting the aid budget, but there had been a promise not to. But any aid cut seems to be being really diverted, so that's good news. So there is a potential for doing that, but it does have to be very carefully done. You have to work with the bodies that work in those countries and the people on the ground. You have to listen to the people who actually understand how their own country works and how to work with it. And as I said, there are some very brave people campaigning out there. You probably heard of David Kato, who was murdered last year, who was kind of the leading campaigner in Uganda. So there are charities being set up. Adrian's mentioned Kaleidoscope, which has been set up by Lance Price with some people who come here from Africa kind of fleeing persecution. Lance Price used to be a press officer at Downing Street, so he can just kind of use his contacts to actually get some publicity for that. There's another group called Sexual Minorities Uganda, SMUG, who we've been talking to David Cairns, who was the Labour MP who died earlier in the year, had been kind of a bit of a champion, been chair of the all-party HIV and AIDS group, and therefore done a lot of work in Africa, and something he'd been particularly championing. And his partner set up a charity called the David Cairns Foundation, which does work here for causes he was interested in, but is also raising money to kind of help campaign in Africa. So I mean, that should be kind of another one to work through. You mentioned the European Union. And for us, I mentioned earlier, we kind of talk to our sister parties, and that's the thing for us. And we've got World Pride here in the summer, and we're hoping we'll see kind of some of our sister parties across and work cross-party. And I think when you mentioned particularly around government, I mean, the good example of that is about 2 years ago when the stuff in Uganda first kicked off. The way it was stopped originally was by Gordon Brown, the Australian Prime Minister, and the Canadian Prime Minister, basically cornering him in a room at a Commonwealth summit and saying, what the hell do you think you're doing? You know, we're not giving you all this money to improve your country if actually you're going to start saying, well, this section of it we don't like, and these people will be persecuted. And the Ugandan stuff at that point was horrendous. I mean, you weren't just going to be locked up, right? You were being executed for being gay. You were then being locked up for knowing about gays. So if you kind of suspected the person on the corner was and didn't say, well, that was an offence, and off to prison for 10 years. I mean, it was nuts stuff. I mean, so there is a kind of using those kind of backroom lobbying networks that governments have through conventions you can do, I think, and makes it. You can't solve the problem, but you can put a break on some of the extremist stuff. And I think we can do things. I mean, you mentioned All Out, which is this group that do a lot of online petitions. I don't know if you've seen them. They're doing one at the moment about St. Petersburg, and I think it's about 250,000 signatures. They wrote back a little bit in St. Petersburg. Most governments don't like that kind of negative publicity because they need international aid, because a lot of them are developing countries. And if they're not, a lot of them need tourism, and Western tourism is where it comes from. And actually, if they've got a reputation for being balmy and oppressive, people aren't going to go there. So actually, you can have some impact. I mean, clearly not the kind of level of impact you need, but at least you can kind of put a break on some of the excesses. We went over with some of our fellow parties in Europe to Warsaw Pride last year, because the previous couple of years it had been particularly oppressive, one of those Eastern European prides that had been banned and been terrible. And actually what happened was, through pressure through the European Parliament, through the European Union, easier because they're an EU member and there are those links in a way you don't get necessarily much with Africa, the authorities there have been persuaded, actually don't ban it, protect it. And I've never seen so many police in a pride parade. You get used to pride parades here where, you know, you either go to small ones like Oxford or Reading where they're kind of small and it's a few hundred people and there's a kind of a grassroots feel about it. You go to the Manchesters, the Brightons, the Londons where you've got, you know, families lining the route and hundreds of thousands of people. That was true in Warsaw, except they were throwing flares at us and smoke grenades and doing Nazi salutes, and actually I was frightened. In a way that I've never been in kind of sort of 20 years of campaigning on LGBT stuff. But fortunately, because of the pressure on the authorities, there was about a line of 10 deep police stopping them. And once we got past the beginning where they were, we found further down, there were ordinary people from Warsaw, particularly older people, outlining the streets. Because for them, these people doing Nazi salutes rather reminded them of the people who'd been oppressing them when they were occupying their country 6 years earlier. So you had people who were 80, kind of thinking, actually, that's not what I went through to have my country turn into that. So curiously, counterintuitively, older people were more supportive, but it was through that pressure, through the European Union, to kind of get the authorities on side. So I think governments, there's a lot they can do, and often a lot of it is that kind of softly behind the scenes, but you know, if it works, and it's what works that matters.
Any other questions?
How do LGBT groups in the political parties begin to remember their T?
Not enough is the answer. We need to. I mean, interestingly, our trans officer was down talking to the Labour group last week, and she's just been selected to stand as a council candidate in Scotland. I think she is our first. I it may even be our first ever trans candidate. Don't hold me to that because I'm not 100% certain. It's something that the party is the area of the four letters that all the parties and society as a whole is falling behind on. And it needs to move forward, and hopefully again it's people like Carol coming forward, and I know he's a Liberal councillor in Cambridge, who was the first mayor, just standing up and being the first person to actually will hopefully bring other people in. It's those small things. Actually, we've got one of our members was a parliamentary candidate. Began their transition process after the general election. I have to say, the response they've got from it was actually in Crispin Blunt, the Tory MP who subsequently came out. He was kind of concerned. The local Labour Party were supportive. How would the opposition? Very good. Crispin Blunt then came out a few weeks later, and you do wonder actually whether that step made it a little bit easier for him to come out as gay, knowing that his Labour candidate was beginning the process of transition. Hopefully so, and hopefully there's that kind of cross-party work you can do. But I think all of us have not been good enough on it, and I think part of the problem is LGBT campaigns. I'm sure it's probably the same in student movement. There are less trans people, and so it's dominated mainly by lesbians and gay people, and there's an issue around bisexuality too. And it's true in politics, and a lot of politicians don't really understand the issues, and we've got a process as groups to kind of educate and kind of make them understand the issues and get them on board and push it more.
Well, for us, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to change the name from Delga is the fact that Delga doesn't represent B and T. I think that was a crucial change that we put forward in September of this year to make sure that we had actually a name that one wasn't an explanation. So we spent the first half an hour telling everyone what Delga stood for, and then secondly we had B and T actually in the name of our group, which was very key. I mean, we've always been pretty good on trans issues in the sense that we had a trans working group within our committee. We do have the first and only currently trans councillor in Cambridge, and the mayor also in Cambridge previously. So I mean, we have it's not done enough, but we have had we know it's a very important issue. And adding to that, I think this is why the government, as I mentioned slightly earlier, has put forward the first ever transgender action plan, which is crucial because there are a lot of issues that affect trans people, especially in health in particular, which don't get covered by the media at all, and many people aren't aware of the difficulties that those issues create. So it's a crucial element to our work, and one that I, as someone who, as a cisgendered gay man, I have to understand and learn all the issues that involve trans people because they're very different and they need to be treated in that way.
Last question.
Hearing about the funding for overseas aid and that it's used a great deal for campaigning, why is it that things like the Department of Culture and Media and the Department of Health don't do campaigns themselves? They don't seem to support LGBT History Month, and they don't seem to support bullying in schools campaigns. I mean, it must be a great shame to the parties these days that the greatest campaigning of this sort of thing was actually done under Margaret Thatcher. I mean, we don't see those sort of campaigns to promote the wealth and health of the LGBT community.
Well, I can sort of add something onto that in the sense that on Monday of last week there was the LGBT History Month at the Oval, where Lynn Featherstone came and spoke as Equalities Minister, and also there was a representative from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So possibly that's the first time that that's happened, but my understanding is those areas of government are being made aware, especially through us three as chairs, that actually yes, they do need to be involved, and they do need to come to events and be present, including the GEO as the Government Equalities Office and things like that. So it may have been in the past that those weren't as noticeable as they should have been, but I think with the sort of chivying that we do behind the scenes, then I will make sure that they do attend, and the same goes for anything health-wise as well. So be assured that we monitor what our MPs and ministers do, and when we see them not turning up at events, there are people like myself and James who will go to them and say, why aren't you attending it, or why aren't you partaking, because it's important that that's represented. So I understand your point, and I think possibly that's possibly the case in the past, but I'll take that forward as a hint to continue to bolster that.
Yeah, I mean, there does need to be more investment. I suspect we probably picked the wrong time to try and get it, because everything's being cut back, as we know. I mean, certainly I know that Stephen Twigg, who's one of our patrons, and obviously very famous, one of the out MPs when he was schools minister, was that the first time he made sure the Department of Education started backing LGBT History Month and projects around that. And it took a gay minister to do it, because I suspect again nobody pushed it. And I know some of the groups, like Stonewall for example, have a deliberate strategy of not asking for government money. It's a point of principle on this that they don't want to be in a position where they're relying on government funding. I know some other groups are like that, but certainly there are groups I think would benefit from it, and can make grants available and look at how you deliver on that, particularly, as you say, through Department of Culture and Department of Education. I suspect we're probably in the wrong time financially to try and get it at the moment, but if you don't ask, you don't get.
I would like you all to join me in thanking Adrian and James for coming down.
Just some housekeeping. Someone's got to do it. Thanks to Kevin as well for organising this event. He's been great. We've got some World AIDS Days ribbons down there for money going to Tony Higgins Trust. Suggest a donation of £1. So if you haven't got one, you'd like one, there's some there. Next Tuesday, we've got in this room at 6 o'clock, we've got our discussion on religion and sexuality. It's open to everyone to come. We've got Islamic Society, Sikh Society, African Caribbean Society, a chaplain from the university, and a representative from NUS LGBT coming down, so it'd be great to see as many of you there. And the following day at 6 PM in Keynes, we have our monthly forum on safe sex. So thank you for coming, and hope to see you at some of our events.
One more thing. Tomorrow in Rutherford Bar we're doing a fundraiser for World AIDS Day. Just going to be around selling ribbons and generally just having some fun, just trying to sell, make some money. So yeah, if you could come down to that, that'd be great. So everyone will be there from 8 o'clock.
Well, I should say I've stuck some of our flyers, our marriage equality ones, and just some general ones about us if you want more information about the doors.
So thanks goes to James and Adrian.
Does anyone know how to turn it off? Or record something in the
It's got like Japanese symbols.